Today on the podcast, we dive into Galaxy's Edge, Pandora, and all the changes coming to Epcot with Tim Grassey of the E-Ticket Report and Marty Called. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 86 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. It is such a crazy time right now at Walt Disney World. I went there in early September, and since that point, we've had the opening and closing and reopening of the Skyliner. You've had the start of Epcot Forever and the Epcot Experience exhibit that has arrived at Epcot to show what's coming in the future. You also have Rise of the Resistance coming to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge in less than a month on December 5th in Walt Disney World. It's a really busy time, which makes it exciting to dive into some of the big topics. This is not a situation where you go, it's the fall. There's not much happening. There's food and wine. That's about it. There's a lot going on. It's only going to continue as we go into next year where you have new films, you have Ratatouille, and then just so much more in 2021. And a person that I really enjoy talking with about some prominent current topics that are happening is Tim Grassey, who is one of the co-hosts of the Marty Called podcast and also the E-Ticket Report podcast. He's been on this show 3 times, and we have focused a lot on the future of Epcot and what we'd like to see there, and also about Galaxy's Edge and Pandora. So now that both of us have been to Walt Disney World recently and visited Galaxy's Edge, he's actually seen it on both coasts. He's also seen Epcot Forever, and Disney has announced more about what they're doing at Epcot at the D23 Expo. This seems like the perfect time to talk with Tim and get both of our reactions of how the experience was at Galaxy's Edge, where it's going with Rise of the Resistance opening, like how good does that attraction need to be, and then what we want to see at Epcot and what we expect Disney is going to do. So this was a really fun conversation with Tim, and it's a rather long one, so I don't want to waste any more time giving my intro. Let's go right to it. Here is my conversation with Tim Grassey. All right, my guest today is back on this podcast for the 4th time. He's the co-host on the E-Ticket Report and the Marty Called podcast, and the owner of WDWThemeparks.com. It's Tim Grassey. And Tim, how does it feel to be on this show for the 4th time?
Dan told me that it was on for the 4th time. I made a bad joke, and then I started looking up what 4th anniversary gifts were. Looks like blue topaz, so what'd you get me?
Oh, well, just getting the chance to talk with me is gift enough for you. I feel like
Perfect.
It's that great. But Tim, seriously, thanks for coming on the show.
Sure, anytime.
We've talked about Epcot in the past and about what we want to do there. And, there's been a few things that Disney has talked about in terms of what they want to do there with their historic transformation and all of that. So I figured we could talk about that. We'll do that a little bit later because I want to leave that for the heart of the podcast. First of all, I will say both you and I know, have been to Galaxy's Edge. We have traveled to Batu. You have been to both California and Florida. I've just been to Florida. But I wanted to talk with you a bit about Galaxy's Edge and what you think. So, just in general, what do you think about Galaxy's Edge now after being there, at least in the way it's currently set up overall?
I think what is there is very good, but incomplete. I think that's the simplest way to put it. I enjoy being in the land. I enjoy many aspects of the land, but there isn't enough there yet. It kind of feels like, this is not the best comparison, but New Fantasyland before Seven Dwarfs Mine Train opened up, where we know that it's missing a component of it. We know that it's missing what is arguably the anchor attraction in the case of Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, and definitely in the case of Rise of the Resistance. I think somebody that is going and is unaware of the second attraction may not necessarily know what is actually missing, but I think they're going to get that feeling that, hey, this is a pretty big area for one ride. So I enjoy Smuggler's Run very much. It has been kind of hoisted with the burden of anchoring a 14-acre land that I don't think is fair to it. But it's a perfectly solid attraction. I'd say it's a very solid D-ticket attraction, if not an E. I'm kind of in the D-ticket camp myself, but I think that the complaints that others have made about it are somewhat unfounded, especially if they had opened the land in its entirety as originally planned.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, too, I went in early September and in Florida, and I had heard enough about Smuggler's Run. I hadn't watched any videos and such, but I kind of went in thinking like, well, I should go see it. It'll be okay. And I did that early morning march of 30 minutes to get there, which not the best idea, I will say. There was better ways to do it. Later on, the line was 20 minutes. I was like, why did I do this? But it was fun. There was kind of a feeling to it. But I actually, I think that I was a little pleasantly surprised by Smuggler's Run because, again, I kind of go into it thinking, okay, I'm going to sit in front of a screen. I'm going to hit some buttons. But I think, and I think you have a similar feeling, but up to the ride itself, I feel like everything is top notch. Best theming they can do. Like, even when you're waiting in line, it said 70 minutes. I waited like 35. It really moved because you walked the whole time. But even they have audio and some of the sets. The Hondo, which was not covered with the cloth, was great. And the Falcon area, everything was very smooth and efficient too. Like, I felt like the way the cast members were, again, it was the first week, so maybe it's changed even by now. But I felt like everything worked. But I think there is a missing touch. Like, that's kind of what you got, I think, with the D-ticket versus E-ticket is up to that point, I don't think there's anything missing. But what can they do to, and they're not going to do this anytime soon, but if they said, we need to make this better, how would they do that without just making some gigantic change?
Are you talking Smuggler's Run specifically or the entire land?
Oh, Smuggler's Run right now. Let's stick with Smuggler's Run.
Multiple missions. I mean, that's not exactly an easy thing to do, but when this was announced to us, they didn't specify the number of missions, and then as more information trickled out about it, we saw concept art of at least one additional mission with, I believe it was a Rathtar figure that attacked us in some way, shape, or form, and not to spoil the attraction for you, but that does not take place on the attraction. So having multiple missions, I think, would help. The other component, and my co-host on Marty Call, Josh, mentioned this, is that maybe toggling what the actual controls are. That trying to have a pilot have one pilot control left and right and one control up and down may not be the best approach. You might have one pilot control pitch and yaw and another control thrust and going to light speed and things like that, where adjust things accordingly to make them a little bit more logical for what you're doing. A smaller thing that I don't think is realistic is if there's a way to perhaps get some sort of control panel that isn't to your 90 degree to your right for the gunners and engineers, that might help. But I don't think that's as big a problem as some people had made it out to be. I don't know if you felt that. What roles did you have when you were on the attraction?
Well, I did the attraction 4 times, and I was never the pilot. I was the gunner on my first ride through standby, and then I did 3 single riders, and I was engineer all 3 times. And I will say that I enjoyed the engineer role more than I thought I would. And granted, it really depended, and I'm going way beyond your question, it really depended on, I will say the first time it was just like all new. It's like, wow, this is incredible. I did the manual gunner role because I thought it would be more fun, and I think it was. But twice out of the 4 times, one time in particular, we had people that really knew what they were doing. We had 6 single riders, and the pilots were really good, and we did really well. And I was like, we really killed this. This is great. One time we had kids piloting. And one time we had 2 people that were over the age of 75, I'm just guessing, And both times we just crashed like crazy. But as an engineer, though, I admit I was very good at that. But I will say, to get more back to your question, I enjoyed getting better at being an engineer because I did it 3 times within succession. Now, if I wrote it 10 times and did that, would I get tired of it? I don't know. But I feel like it was better than, like, because if I went in kind of thinking, I'm just going to hit some buttons and whatever. But there is a lot going on in a sense where, in a weird way, when I had poor pilots, I had more to do as an engineer. So it was actually more fun because I was constantly like trying to save the ship basically as we crashed into everything. So I think it's good that, I mean, even having multiple jobs, it's still a way step up over like Mission Space, which I did when I forgot which role I was because I couldn't figure it out from where I was sitting. And so I never knew when to hit the button. So that's more me revealing something about myself there, I think. But I agree with you on the custom missions and even on the roles. Yeah, I think the pilot change, while I did listen to your show, and I think that's a good idea because when you had people that knew what they were doing and could work together, it worked well. When even one of the two, especially the one going up and down, was not ready, oh boy. Because I think really, I feel like you're going mostly on a straight line. It's just if you don't go down and crash into everything. I don't feel like the left and right is as important, at least from my memory.
Well, the other suggestion that Josh had on the show was having some level of control on the sensitivity of the pilot controls, and you can govern manual versus automatic controls at the gunner level. Engineer doesn't really have. I can't think of a logical way to make that more or less complicated. But I think with the pilot, you should be able to have a level of sensitivity adjustment pre-ride. So if somebody's ridden before, they know what they're doing, I think they can also get that and maybe have a little bit more variability because they sold this as something being rendered in real time, but I don't think there's too many frames in there that are truly that are original to each ride. It seems like you're going to get a very similar ride each time. You're going in a universe that exists. You are constrained by invisible barriers, depending, like if you were to slam the ship to the left or the right all the way and just continue riding it that way, ultimately you're going to be constrained by an invisible wall. So not to say that they need to eliminate that, but actually have some level of flexibility in the sensitivity of it. We know that they can adjust it because all these things are taken care of during test and adjust, but if that sensitivity can be somewhat controlled by the guest riding it with a simple pre-ride press of a button, then so be it. I'd be on board with something like that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. It actually makes me think that I'm sure there is someone who's either done a YouTube channel or a blog or whatnot who has gotten in the vehicle and tested to go how far left they can go and how far right and everything.
Oh, sure.
I haven't looked it up, but now I'm kind of really curious about that. But I think it all gets back to what you said originally about the different missions or variations within the mission, because I did have twice out of my 4 times I had the extra asteroid belt scene at the end, which had to do, I think, with if someone needs extra time and whatnot in your group. But I thought that even made it better, where instead of just getting out of there and crashing, basically, and having Chewie take over, you actually had those extra few minutes. So I don't even feel like, I mean, yes, an extra mission would be incredible, but I feel like in a way, if they could even vary it up more, like, you know, there's something else where you're not hitting all the same beats every time, where they say, oh, it's worse, and you fly down and all that, which I enjoyed. But yeah, think about it. I mean, even 2 missions or 3, the amount of people that would just ride that over and over and over again, or if even like a Star Tours setup where you had like, now you're getting a little complicated here, but like different elements of each one where something different happens with the Star Destroyer or someone comes in differently. I feel like there's an exponential amount of ideas. The question is if they think it's needed, and a lot of that may depend on how successful Rise of the Resistance is to depend on what they want to do with Smuggler's Run.
The an interview you did recently, and forgive me because I forget who it was with, they mentioned the transition into lightspeed in the new Star Tours as being a logical transition point. Star Wars has those. Has those logical spots to break from whatever story you're in and have it be kind of a tree that branches out. Star Tours does that when it first opened. What did it have? 54 different ride combinations, and now it's increased significantly because within those individual scenes, there's variations that they can do as well. And I kind of expected a level of that with Smuggler's Run. So if I'm going to level a true criticism with it, it would be that they don't have those small variations within each scene. You pretty much you control where you go in the scene, but there should be a level of other components happening to you in that scene. I don't know how better to explain it, but there's enough in the Star Wars universe that can happen on your ride path, and you can have really an infinite number of other scenarios play out that kind of happen randomly to make it seem like each ride is a little bit more unique.
Definitely. And I think, like Star Tours, this was years ago. I remember there was one point I was in the park by myself, even at Disneyland, and I rode it like 6 times because I just wanted, it was right after, pretty soon after the Adventures Continue had been put in place. And but it was easy to keep rewriting it because I kept getting the same stupid one. I don't know how many times I have to go to Naboo before they just, stop it, I don't want to go that way. But regardless, it just shows to the rewritability though, because... Yeah. And now Star Tours at Hollywood Studios doesn't have a big line, but at the time at Disneyland was still very popular, and I think still is. Because of that, that's a big part of it, and its location. So, and I think there's more they can do. But I want to get to Rise of the Resistance, because I think this is obviously pretty soon. I mean, we're basically only a little more than when we're recording this, a month out from when it's supposed to open at Disney World. And as far as we know, that's when it's going to open. And I think I hope it doesn't have like a Hagrid situation where there's some issues. But so first up, I mean, instead of just asking if it's going to be good or not, or what do we think, here's my interesting question for you.
Okay.
How good does this need to be in order to really move the needle? And I know now crowds are coming because of fall break and stuff, and Disneyland is getting more people. So I'm not saying that they're total failures or anything, but like, what does this have to be to really, I hate to say justify the costs, but really make this land something special?
It needs to be the best ride in the world. Other than that, it should be fine. No pressure. I mean, in all seriousness, though, it needs to be in the conversation at the very least. And everything that they have done promoting this land, despite what Mr. Iger said, saying, "Oh, we're just going to say that it's open." They've promoted it. They've talked about it for 4 years now. This is the anchor attraction. This is what they are doing to show what Imagineering can do. And if it's not in the conversation for best ride in the world, then they failed. The attendance could come in and they could view it as a success, but creatively, it needs to be the best ride in the world. And that's a very objective, or subjective, whatever the word is. Whatever the appropriate word is, that's what I meant. That's an opinion-based variable there, but I think we can recognize things and recognize excellence. There are very few people that go on something like Splash Mountain or Tower of Terror or Spider-Man or Forbidden Journey and say, these are bad rides. Objectively, we can say these are very good rides, and you wouldn't begrudge anybody saying that they're their favorite rides. This needs to be at the very least in that conversation. And I don't think Smuggler's Run is in that conversation, but Rise of the Resistance absolutely has to be in that conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I think Smuggler's Run, I feel like, is in a tier for me, actually, where, like, because I recently updated my blog post of my 10 favorite attractions at Walt Disney World, and because I saw some new things. I saw Flight of Passage, I saw Slinky Dog. Slinky Dog and Smuggler's Run were not considered very closely. They're both solid, they're fun. I like Smuggler's Run more a bit, but still, and I don't want to turn this into me talking about my favorite attractions, but just as an example, it didn't really crack it. But Rise of the Resistance, for me, I have no doubts that when that thing is working full on, it's going to be spectacular. My only concern is just because it's so novel in terms of multiple ride systems and huge areas with giant screens and animatronics, and getting people off of one vehicle And at least from what we know, apparently getting people onto another vehicle and maybe having you wait in between and somehow making that not seem like you're just waiting in a long line in the middle and it actually seeming like an experience, those are huge hurdles. I mean, there's got to be some really complicated boards on the wall with different things to figure this out and everything. So, I mean, do you think they could pull it off? Can they do it?
It is remarkably complicated, but think of it, break it down to its components. So we know enough about this ride to look at each section that Dan is describing here. So leaving one vehicle, boarding another one. What you're talking about there is that transport ship that brings you to the Star Destroyer, right?
Yeah, basically the first one, which is kind of like, I mean, I don't know, you could call it a Star Tours, you could call it almost, it's like it's sort of the pre-show, but it's a vehicle in a way.
I think that's the way to look at it, though. Think of it like the elevators in Gringotts or the non-elevators at the Florida version of Haunted Mansion, or the whatever your pre-show of choice is. I would imagine this would probably have some component in it similar to how they have the built-in delays at Flight of Passage. That's my guess, where if they want to regulate how people get out of here and not have operational backups. Like, think of Haunted Mansion, for example, where I think this is what you're fearing, where you get out of the stretch room and then you're waiting in a line again, or you're funneling into the line again. I think the goal is to avoid that. And they've made operational decisions that kind of reinforce that they don't want it to have a backup there. And that's not to say that they won't, but it seems like they're trying to avoid that. And one of the operational changes that they're making, you've probably seen this, is that they're modifying the vehicle doors for ADA compliance. Why they didn't think about this 4 years ago, I don't know, but they're modifying every vehicle door. Whereas if you think of your various boat rides around property, there's a handful of boats that can accommodate wheelchairs, and not all of them can. And historically, guests that require that extra time or that extra space are forced to wait for that specific vehicle. In this case, they're adapting all 38 ride vehicles for ADA compliance. And my assumption is they're doing this so that, not necessarily from a efficiency of throughput standpoint, but from a efficiency of show standpoint, where they don't want people waiting in that line. They want them to get off that transport ship right into their 8-person vehicle to go around the Star Destroyer. That's my guess.
No, that's a great point. And actually, Haunted Mansion and Tower of Terror are the two that drive me nuts, where you get out and you're just like, great, now I get to stand here for another 20 minutes. It's like I felt like I was here and I'm not. So those are, and especially Tower of Terror. But regardless, that was a question I had because way back, like early on, I remember there was an article in Slash Film was the first time I saw this article where they talked about the fact that you might actually get off one vehicle and go to another. And my first thought was, what about all the people that like ride ECVs and everything? Like, because the idea then was you're going to be chased by stormtroopers and you're going to have to run. And I thought, that is insane. That will never work. But now that you're describing it, granted, since then we've heard that it's not really that. It's more like you're prisoners or you're being held. It's not that you're running away from someone, because it's not like this is going to be a haunted house at like Halloween Horror Nights or something. You have to, it's still Disney. But I am fascinated though by the logistics. And you bring up Flight of Passage is interesting because I didn't even think about that when I rode that, and how they have you go through those multiple pre-show rooms, like, now we're going to scan you again and all that. And I'm like, why are they doing so much of this? Yeah. Some of that is for delays, right? It's to make sure that when you go into your room, that then you sit down and bam, you're on it. I hadn't even considered that. That's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense because I didn't understand why we got scanned twice and why that guy just kept talking to me. I didn't get it.
Disney in recent years has kind of built in these delays in a pre-show and an attraction itself. You mentioned it 10 minutes ago, the meteor scene in Smuggler's Run, where they're recognizing that there's value to be had in keeping somebody entertained. Whereas previously, the only version of this that existed was on a boat ride when they would cascade at the end of the ride. When you're on Pirates of the Caribbean, for example, when you're backed up a couple of show scenes, that's obviously by design, where they want to make sure that they always have a boat ready to dispatch and unload at the same time. So in this case, if there's a delay for any reason, they at least have additional show for you. On something like Pirates of the Caribbean, you're moving through a physical set, so you can look around, you can see them in the jail scene. Whatever scene you're stuck in, you're at least not staring at a blank screen or something. So that's kind of the logic with this. And we really hadn't seen it in previous attractions that had screens, but now that they can, press a button and you extend the ride by 10 seconds, or kind of build in a delay mechanism like they have in the Flight of Passage pre-show. All of that is just kind of a new thing that goes unnoticed by 90% of guests, but is a somewhat creative use of not wasting our time while wasting our time.
Yeah, exactly. It's a brilliant way to do so. And I think I know that they recognize the importance of this attraction being spectacular, because they're drawing people and such. But I'll admit, I mean, granted, we all expected when it would open there would be 2 attractions, so everyone looked at it and went, and everyone's thought was, we called it the battle attraction, but Rise of the Resistance, the wait's going to be like 6 hours or 8 hours or whatever. And granted, I don't think it'll ever be that, and I hope it's not, because that would be insane. And I think I noticed with Smuggler's Run that they were really efficient with how they let you in and how they moved you through, more than I expected. And I know that the throughput is still not Pirates of the Caribbean level, but it's also, I think they learned some things from Pandora and kind of the challenges there with the lines. Just overall, looking at Galaxy's Edge overall, my other thing about it is I went to Oga's Cantina, and granted, I was there by myself. Not really the optimal thing. You go there at 10 a.m. by yourself. It's not really the optimal place to be at a bar themed to Star Wars. So that was part of it. But then you have that where the drinks are just crazy insane. And then you have Savi's and you have the Droid Depot. And I think the land looks epic. It looks amazing. I really like the way the land looks. I love all the details. But there's a lot of things that cost a lot of extra money to do there. So even after Rise of the Resistance opens, I still feel like they may have erred a little bit too much on the let's get all the money recouped. And I feel like there needs to be a few more things to do in that land beyond people that want to spend all day on their phones. I mean, is that, I'm just curious to get your thoughts on if I'm being a little too harsh on them.
So atmospheric entertainment would absolutely help. And I mean, I've said it a few different places. I don't know that it's 100% necessary to step away from the point in the Star Wars timeline that they've established Batuu as existing in. Where what I mean by that is, I don't mean to step away from the sequel trilogy. It's not absolutely necessary to do that. However, if you're going to have those characters exist elsewhere in the land, I think you need more atmospheric characters. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be specific characters that fit in the movie. But there is a Star Wars vibe that can come from aliens that look to be in that universe just roaming the land. And I know that they promised droids, and that isn't happening either. But there's plenty of elevated areas where they can have seemingly random atmospheric entertainment take place. They've done this on a smaller scale where they have Rey kind of tinkering around the various ships in the Resistance area and then seemingly recruiting people to go up against the First Order. That type of stuff happens, but I don't think there's enough of it. And conversely, I think you can have the stormtroopers have an even greater presence than they do. You'll oftentimes see a couple of stormtroopers walking around, sometimes with Kylo Ren, sometimes without. And I think if you have them even just patrolling the area from above, that helps tremendously. And adding that type of stuff really just brings the vibe of it that much more into the Star Wars universe. Because you could conceivably go there and, aside from the Millennium Falcon visual itself, not fully identify this as Star Wars. I think there is a risk of that, and the characters add a tremendous amount to that to help that out.
I agree. And actually, when I got there, I mentioned that march in the morning. The first thing we saw was I saw Rey and Chewbacca working on a ship. And then also I saw some of my favorite things from that morning were stormtroopers giving people trouble about their phones and all that, and talking, put away that data pad and all that. And then another point where I did see Kylo Ren for a moment walking around, but then there was like an Imperial officer and several stormtroopers that were like hassling people, and people loved it. Like not only the people that they were involved with, the entire crowd around them. And plus in today's era of Instagram and Snapchat and all those things, people are just shooting everything with their phones. That to another degree, like even just with, you don't have to have Luke and Leia and Han and all that. Granted, sure, that would have been easier, but if they're really going to commit to this universe, they got to commit to it more, I feel like. Like that's that. I think you make a great point about the entertainment.
What's there is great. I just want more of it. I want to step away from that question. You mentioned Oga's Cantina. Did you get anything there?
I did. I decided I was going to get a beer, but then I had been up really late the night before and woke up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. and I was like, I just can't. So I had like a cold brew coffee that was really just like a sugar bomb. And then I had like this oatmeal thing, which was really like a sugar bomb, basically. But again, the two added up to like, the thing was, it was me too. I just looked at it and I went, it's 10 in the morning. Do I want to spend $15 on a beer or even more on a mixed drink? So I spent like $15 on a drink and food. But then I felt kind of dumb because I was just, they had me stand at the bar because I was a solo person, you know? And granted, if I was there with a group of my friends at 8 p.m. at night and didn't care about the money, I think it'd be really fun. So again, I don't feel like my perspective there is the best it ever could be. But what was yours like? What were your experiences like?
So I did it in both Disneyland and Disney World, and I enjoyed it. I don't drink at all, but I tried some of the non-alcoholic beverages. And I just think the vibe in there is great. And granted, I wasn't there at 10 o'clock in the morning. I was there, I think, in Disneyland, I was there in the evening. And then in Disney World, I was there maybe like 2 o'clock or so. My pro tip is if you're going to go non-alcoholic and you order the Java Juice, it comes with boba balls in it, but it also comes with cubed ice that is dimpled, basically defeating the purpose of the boba balls because you're not going to get any of them. So if you order that, order it with crushed ice, which they do have for other drinks. I think actually I know one of these is the Blue Bantha is same thing as the Blue Milk, just not frozen. I enjoyed the non-alcoholic drinks in Oga's Cantina better than Blue or Green Milk. And there also are a couple of non-alcoholic drinks at both Ronto's Roasters and Docking Bay 7 that I thought were better as well. But I think you hit the nail on the head. For the most part, any of these things are just going to be super sugary. So if that's not your thing, then going to specialty drinks inside a theme park probably isn't for you either. So...
Yeah, I had the Blue Milk, and I actually thought that was okay. I had that outside. But again, I had heard it was so terrible that I was like, oh, it's not bad.
It was edible. I mean, that's not the best compliment, but it's not anything that I need to get again. Whereas when I'm in Pandora, I get a Night Blossom every time and sometimes twice. So that's just my own personal preference. I know there are people that swear by butterbeer. There's a handful of people that like the one over in New Fantasyland. I'm sure that there are people that like Blue Milk, but I don't think they're selling as much of it as they anticipated. But no skin off my back. I mean, I didn't go to see the land for just that. If it was good and I liked it, great. It would be another component of the land that I liked. But I'm not devastated that Blue Milk was less than what I expected it to be because I didn't really have any expectations.
No, to me, it's almost just like, okay, sure, it's something unique to the land. Let's try it. And then, yeah, it wasn't one of those cases where I was like, it all comes down to this. If this is good, the land rules. If not, it's terrible. But I want to move on soon. But on a related note about Pandora, because, you know, last time we talked, which was about a year ago, I was already I had been raving about Pandora, having been there earlier that year. And I went and didn't even do Flight of Passage because I was there with my kids and whatnot. So I finally did Flight of Passage. I mentioned it a minute ago. And I kind of had okay expectations. I was like, it's going to be all right. It's sitting in front of a screen. I've heard it's like Soarin', but it's more intense. Holy cow, Tim. People are not underestimating that attraction.
So if you go in, and this is how we were all sold on it. I wrote something a while back, just kind of talking about how Disney preys on the familiarity, and we as humans are simple-minded, often childlike in how we approach things. That we need to explain something to ourselves, to other people, in a framework that is digestible. Like a movie pitch, you come up with 2 sentences to explain a 2-hour movie. In the same way that we described this attraction as Soarin' over Pandora. And yes, if you boil it down to its simplest form, it is. And I love Soarin'. If it's not my favorite attraction in Epcot, it's probably my second favorite. But this is a different enough attraction and takes enough steps away from Soarin' that it's great. I mean, I know that you're not a fan of Kilimanjaro safaris. And by the way, how long have you hated animals, out of curiosity?
No, I actually do like Kilimanjaro safaris. I think
sure. That's not what you said a few episodes ago. But
yeah, you're referring to my note. Well, here's what I had: just a really lame experience on that day. I don't know what it was. The animals were all just kind of like, hey, how's it going? No, I just didn't have a great experience. I think Kilimanjaro Safaris is great. I just came out of it that time and I was like, we need something here. And granted, I'm thinking back to, yes, they had that weird big red, little red and the weird thing, but they didn't have the bridge. It just seemed like it was very like, okay, this is fine. But I think, again, that's very experience-based, just to talk about. I love the Animal Kingdom. That's why we've talked about it before, but having now ridden Flight of Passage, I'm like, it just, Pandora and even the Animal Kingdom itself, I'm just like, it's all clicking together, Tim. It's there. I like it, The
point that I was going to make before putting you on the defensive was that for me, it's probably number 2 in that park now. Not that it had to grow on me, because I loved Flight of Passage from day one, but my initial slotting of it was that I think I still like Expedition Everest better. I like the idea of just moving through a physical space better. I'm more apt to gravitate towards that. But there are some moments in Flight of Passage, especially when you're like hugging the water and the wave is cresting around you, that are just amazing, extremely exhilarating experiences. And I think what Pandora accomplishes better than any of these themed environments, that the single IP themed environments, is that I don't think you need to see the movie to appreciate all aspects of that land. And it's not to criticize the lands like Harry Potter, which absolutely prey on the familiarity and is effectively Mecca for Harry Potter fans. But I think with Avatar, I think they recognize too that this may not have the emotional attachment to the intellectual property that some of these other ones that they've chosen to turn into 10 to 14 acre lands do. So they took the right amount of Avatar, put it in there, and then just said, all right, if James Cameron and Disney teamed up to make a world full of alien animals and we put it in the Animal Kingdom, what would it be? And they came up with it. And if Avatar didn't exist, it would still work. And I can't say enough positive things about it. And don't get me wrong, it, like any other theme park land and attraction, has its flaws. But I think from a execution of theme standpoint, they absolutely nailed it and really fit like a glove into the Animal Kingdom. And we were very worried as fans that it wasn't going to.
Yeah, and I've been impressed in how it's still, like, I hadn't walked through even that queue. I mean, I did the FastPass queue, but even as you're walking in through the FastPass queue and you walk by that waterfall and stuff, I'm like, I've never seen the land from this perspective before, and it makes it even look more impressive, like the scale. And Galaxy's Edge has a really impressive scale too, but just given that, all the way it fits in the Animal Kingdom, like you mentioned, I was trying to think back to the last time that I rode a theme park, and I'm not saying it's the best attraction I've ever ridden, but like first time, like think of this, like the first time you ride something where like, because there's a lot of things I've ridden many times, and part of it is there haven't been that many like e-ticket level attractions being built that maybe I've done recently. But like I sit down in my weird Banshee and they buckle you in, and the way that it pulls you forward, like it took me a minute before I looked over and saw the other people, because it's like they set you up in this little room with like 8 people or 10 people or whatnot, and just the way they maximize that technology, where like you said, when you go down past the water and then that like creature comes flying up, and I was like, holy cow. And I think the last time I had an experience like this was either first time on Everest when the Yeti still worked, or first time on Soarin' over California, like really where I hadn't watched ride videos and I didn't know much about them. And that says a lot. Now, granted, will it hold up as much when I've ridden it a bunch of times? I'm not sure.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, but it just sells the land so much. And I promise this won't just be I already did a podcast where I raved about Flight of Passage for 10 minutes, so I won't do that again. But So looking at Pandora, immersive land, like you said, it really hits. It's got great food. It's got gorgeous landscape too. Well, one great attraction, one attraction I like more than most people. But like, what's the future? This is a big question, but we've seen how Galaxy's Edge has not totally hit. And I know Rise of the Resistance could help, but they spent so much money on it. I mean, we're talking possibly over $1 billion for two, multiple $1 billion, whatever you want to say. I mean, are we going to see theme park vendors keep doing these immersive lands? I mean, we may see it with Epic Universe that Universal's doing, but is there starting to be a risk now of diminishing returns in terms of guest interest because there are only so many Harry Potters out there?
Right. Oh, absolutely. So the concept of a single themed land itself isn't flawed. It's just restrictive. You need to be very selective of what lands you're choosing. And theme park attractions have existed for decades without the familiarity to the source material being the motivation for their popularity. But we have to recognize that times change, personalities change. I mean, look at the box office. I knowing that this question was coming, we do some preparation for these shows. Movies are becoming increasingly risk averse, so why shouldn't other forms of entertainment follow suit? If you look at the 2019 domestic box office, there is one movie in the top 10 for domestic gross that is an original concept, and that's Us. You go back 10 years, there was a few. There was Avatar at number 1, Up at number 5, and Hangover at number 6. And in 1999, it was probably 50-50, where you had like The Sixth Sense and Austin Powers and The Matrix. So we've shifted away from trying to come up with original concepts. And I think people do prey on that familiarity in all aspects of life. But it's also why when something is created out of whole cloth, it often becomes a phenomenon. That's kind of hard to do anymore. And I honestly fear that Disney is incapable of doing that. So when you look at a single movie-based attraction as opposed to a land based on an attraction, there's flaws with that as well. Because if you look and you want to put in, pick your poison, pick a Toy Story ride, and you want to force it into an area that it loosely fits into, you dilute the original intention of that area. People praise Tokyo Disney Sea, but there are even flaws with that park where you can say that they're forcing intellectual property where it doesn't belong in that park as well. And if you've listened to me on this show or other shows, you know that I'm very much against forcing things where they don't belong. And I recognize that there's a need for it. But the greater thing here is that quality should always win out. And be it tied to a movie, be it original concept, you can have both and be successful. I'm actually more inclined to push towards the land created out of whole cloth that's tied to a movie. I'm far more in favor of that than, say, putting a movie into a land where it loosely fits. And I mean, we could talk about this for the next 3 hours if you wanted to. But it is a very tricky discussion. And then even within that concept of a single themed land, there is the different approaches to it, like the Harry Potter approach where you're basically reproducing what you know, or the Pandora Star Wars approach where you go with the inspired by route. So you got to kind of pick your poison as to what works for what intellectual property as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, because Pandora, I don't feel like could work if you tried to recreate the movie. One, the movie is it's more militaristic. It's, it has its moments, but it's very different. It's more of a, machines and corporation versus the land kind of fight, which to me doesn't seem to fit as much in the Animal Kingdom, but I feel like they did a really good job of referring to the movie but not doing it. Star Wars is trickier, though, because you could have gone different routes, and that's where the criticism comes in. But again, I personally, after being there, yes, if they wanted to print money, they could put a Death Star in there, have that, do the Millennium Falcon in some way, just pick your poison, from whatever. And granted, there are problems you could have there, but the odds are good. It's safer. I don't know if it's the best business move, but I appreciate artistically and creatively that they are trying to do something else. And I know absolutely. You could say it's a business move because the new movies, but I don't know if it really works. So I think it's cool what they're doing, and even doing weird things like having Hondo be your lead character in an attraction. It's kind of weird, but you can't say it's the most obvious way to go, right?
So there are plenty of choices that were made in Star Wars Galaxy's Edge that were interesting. And you asked the question about how good Rise of the Resistance happens to be. I don't think I'm understating it to say that people's jobs are on the line based on the quality of Rise of the Resistance. I think that because the initial opening of the land did not generate the attendance, possibly the money boost that they were expecting, I think it's safe to say that Scott Trowbridge, who was the lead on it, his job may potentially be called into question, as well as Bob Chapek, who was the head of Parks and Resorts and Consumer Products and the Target integration. All of these things, all of those components of the land, as well as the way that the rides fit into the land, were creative choices, it sounds like. They weren't mandates from above. It sounds like these were creative choices. And the familiarity versus inspired by argument is a tricky one. I think with Harry Potter, you go in with the expectation of visiting Hogsmeade, of visiting Diagon Alley, and those expectations are satisfied. With Star Wars, what do? I think if you're going to go with a single IP-based land, you need a level of familiarity, regardless of whatever the IP is. But with Star Wars, let's say that they didn't have the Falcon in it, and they were just running a mission for Hondo on a generic Star Wars ship. Let's hypothetically just call it a Star Speeder. We need to find another spot for the familiarity. So where does that come in? Is it with characters? Or perhaps the familiarity comes with the destinations you visit on that simulator. And then I just created Star Tours, which we've already done. So you need to come up with a way to bring you into a land, a universe in Star Wars that is so expansive that I think picking a single planet that people know may not have been the best approach, unless they knew they were going to go full on Harry Potter and have it in 2, possibly 3 parks, which I don't know was the right idea either. And given the original response, the initial response this summer, that would have really backfired. So I don't know if it's one causes the other. Like, say they built Tatooine and the attendance would have been much higher. I don't know. But I think that putting it on a planet that we don't know may have been the right move. I don't really fault them for that.
Yeah. And granted, about 2 or 3 months from now, we will be able to have a better assessment of possibly creatively, but also just like you said, I don't think you're overstating it by saying that this is really, I mean, Bob Chapek was doing the interviews at Galaxy's Edge when it started. It wasn't Bob Iger. It was, right. I mean, Iger may be gone just if he retires in 2021. But I want to get to Epcot, but I wanted to mention one more thing about when you talked about quality, because I read Bob Iger's book recently, his autobiography. It's a very quick read. It's not one of those like 500-page things or whatnot. But he talked about coming into Disney, and he was talking more from the movie side because he really doesn't talk much about theme parks in that book. But
that's not his game. He is. You can say all the justifiable criticisms of him and his treatment of the theme parks you want. I really can't argue with anything he's done in the movie business. There's some certainly missteps with ESPN, but for the most part, aside from the theme parks, I don't really have too much negative to say, but I have a lot negative to say about the theme park approach.
Yeah, and I think with movies, he said we need to have quality. That's why one of the reasons he was so attracted to keeping Pixar and keeping bringing in Marvel, and he recognized Disney is not making enough quality movies. Animation is particularly where it was, but even with Marvel, we bring in these properties. They already are, Marvel had done a few, and then Pixar had done of quite a few, and it brings a quality. And I think, too, that approach is great. And for the most part with theme parks, they've done it. But I think it's taking a similar mentality, like we're going to acquire things and drop them in places. And that's where it's been a bit trickier. And I think that's all, though, good background for the discussion of Epcot, because what they are doing there, if you had asked me to bet money on what their choices were going to be before D23, what they announced is not what I would have put money on. But it's not the worst, right? It's not the worst thing they could have done, right?
I definitely want to talk about Epcot with you, but I want to go back to what you were talking about with Iger with movies.
Sure.
And a point here, he recognized the shift in movies to blockbusters. He recognized the movies that could frame those blockbusters and basically purchased the distribution rights to the first Avengers movie, in addition to Pixar as well. But I don't know that he could have predicted how successful the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become, but at least saw that, hey, we had other studios taking the risk to build up to this ensemble movie that was really the first of its kind in the first Avengers movie, and they moved from there. And I'm not a huge fan of the live action remakes of my childhood, but they're at least recognizing, all right, we can do these things and they'll make $1 billion just without breaking too much of a sweat. And they've figured that out, and they've shifted away from those like movies that had like a $40 or $50 million budget. And the rest of the industry has also kind of learned that. And all those things, all those like rom-coms that are relatively inexpensive to make, but, you know, maybe hit like 70, 80 million in the domestic box office, those all moved over to Netflix. The model of the industry has changed in the last 10 years. And I think that the Marvel purchase, even more so than the Pixar purchase, may have been the motivator for that change. But anyway, back to Epcot. So to your question about the changes that they announced, I don't know that there was any leak of the split up of Future World ahead of it with World Celebration, Nature, and Discovery. I got to be honest, I like it. I like the fact that they're at least defining areas. And I've long said that Discovery is a great theme for the front half of that park, even more so than the concept of future. I would argue that World Nature draws several parallels to Disney's Animal Kingdom, and that just conceptually, those two, that section of what is now Future World and all of Animal Kingdom are largely interchangeable in concept. And World Celebration is a bit of an unknown because we don't know what Spaceship Earth is going to become, and presumably we don't know what changes are coming to Imagination. So that's a bit of an unknown for me. But I at least like that they are defining areas. And that was something that 2 years ago, when Tom Fitzgerald took the stage at the D23 Expo, it didn't seem like they had any idea where they were going with it, just that they were making changes. So I appreciate that they've defined something.
Yeah, I think you and I talked after that and made fun of it pretty good. Their weird quotes that they were talking about.
Yeah.
Which
go back and listen to episode whatever.
Yeah, I think it was the second one we did. I forget, but I'll link all those in the show notes if people haven't heard, because that was entertaining to talk through that. But it's interesting, and I do want to tie this a bit because you talked about, your points are right on about the blockbuster culture with movies and such, and the move away from it. And I've actually kind of fretted about this in the past in terms of theme parks, where I'm like, rarely do we see a really good second tier attraction. You have a lot of like a film or Guardians of the Galaxy or something.
Right.
You don't have things in between. But a lot of the changes that they are announcing for Epcot, even in terms of the split, but even this Moana Journey of Water and then putting in the Festival Center and whatnot. I mean, you could say, oh, well, those aren't really that exciting or whatnot. But these are kind of complementary changes.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I appreciate that they're doing. Now, granted, we have to see what it ends up being. But I appreciate that they are, because this is something they haven't done with Epcot at all. Like, they've done a piecemeal approach, but most of their changes have pulled back from the thematic cohesion or unity of the original park. It seems like they're trying to put that back together, whether it's through the logos or through everything. But like you said, there are still a lot of unknowns. So I feel better about it than I did, but I feel like I still don't really know all the information right now, at least.
Oh yeah, we definitely are missing significant information, but they've at least teased some aspects of it. So I think, looking purely aesthetically, I like that they're building a new structure in Future World with the Festival Center, whatever they're ultimately going to call it. I like that they're doing that. The Journey of Water walkthrough. It was kind of laughable to watch Twitter for 12 hours when we saw the poster for a Moana attraction, and Epcot fans, myself included, lost their mind, saying, "Oh Christ, they're putting Moana in Epcot. Is nothing sacred?" And the way that they showed it, and whether this is actually what is going to happen, it seems to be very minimalistic, and really it's more about nature. It's not playing up Moana, and if maybe there's instrumental tracks from the movie and signage that is reflecting some of the characters, fine. But I'm expecting it to be a more natural extension of what the imagination exterior area is, the fountains out there. I think it's going to be kind of a combination of that and maybe the Oasis exhibits in the Animal Kingdom without the animals. So I'm expecting it to be just kind of a peaceful walking path. And that type of thing, you're absolutely right. It's not a $400 million attraction, but it doesn't mean it doesn't enhance the environment of the park. So those things I have zero opposition to. There are certainly some areas of concern, but those are not them.
And that's the thing. I appreciate everything I see in terms of the aesthetic. I appreciate it. Seems like if they can do even 75% of what it looks like. I mean, that building, the model makes it look like it's just a building covered by trees, which I don't really understand, but I think it's going to look good. Now, I want to also flip around a bit, because I feel like a lot of the split of Future World sounds good. The Moana thing is fine, assuming, like you said, that it's not too over the top. But here's a few warning things for me here. Spaceship Earth. Now, I appreciate they're going to put money into Spaceship Earth. The switch to storytelling on the surface doesn't bother me that much. Now, what's the level of concern from you, though, on this not turning into, okay, first half, cavemen, Rome, everything. Second half, Disney characters, movies, the whole deal. What do you think about this?
There is a level of concern. And I will say that level of concern has increased, and it has nothing to do with anything Disney has done about Spaceship Earth. It has a lot to do with Epcot Forever. It has, I guess some things to do with Spaceship Earth. It has something to do with that presentation over in the Odyssey. Did you get a chance to see that, by the way?
I didn't. It opened right after, and it looks spectacular.
It absolutely is spectacular.
But I'm curious if you've seen it, so I'd love to hear more about your impressions, though.
By all accounts, if you haven't been over there, if you were thinking that it was something to be easily dismissed, by all means go over there. In terms of a Circle Vision show, a multimedia experience, they did a fantastic job. And as long as you're not a classic Epcot fan and can see ignore the substance over the style that's there, you're going to be very entertained. But there are some substance issues that are concerning. When they showed Spaceship Earth at the D23 Expo, they showed a couple of scenes. They showed one that looked like the Phoenician scene and one that looked like the caveman scene, with some changes to it. They talked about the story light, which I know you've discussed on the show, and there seemed to be a hint at something that people are suggesting is the manta from Moana. I don't believe that's the case. But what threw me is in this presentation over at the Epcot Experience is they transitioned in and out of the Spaceship Earth segment with the lanterns from Tangled, which really tells me that they're going to have some component of Disney storytelling in there that is tied back to their movies, and that bothers me. It doesn't seem like that's a fit here. And by all means, change Spaceship Earth. They do it every 10 years or so. But I fear that they're going to change the meaning of the attraction. And if you're going to do that, rip it out entirely and change it. Don't do it halfway. Don't do it like Dan just suggested, where you've got, all right, the front half is what we know about Spaceship Earth, and then the back half is, well, here's some Disney movies that we like, that we want to put in here and promote and sell merchandise for. I'd say all or nothing, I mean, at this point. And there was concepts 20 years ago for gutting it and putting a roller coaster in there that I'm sure you've heard about. But that's not what they're doing here. They're going to keep it a dark ride, and I hope that it's going to be still in the same vein of Epcot, and a shift from storytelling to a shift from communications to storytelling very well may make it more timeless. And there are ways to do that where you talk about storytelling across a variety of cultures that doesn't need to involve Disney movies, doesn't need to involve even the existing framework of the attraction, but still fits the spirit of Epcot, that I'd be absolutely on board with. So I'm cautiously optimistic about it, but I'd say that there is greater than a 0% chance that this gets messed up. And I fear that that's going to happen.
Tim, you said it's more timeless, but here's the big question. Is it more Disney and more family? That's the question.
Dan is quoting our not-so-beloved Bob Chapek with that line. I don't know that that actually means anything. And we look back at what you define as Disney and the memories that you created, presumably going back to childhood. And one thing that I fear that a lot of these retrofitted attractions don't have, what they lack, is that charm, that thing that kind of brings us back, where there is a logic to it. And we may not necessarily know on the 50th ride through that it all makes sense together, but subconsciously it all makes sense. And then when you've got a deviation from that, when you've got something that breaks from either the theme of the individual ride or the theme of the area, it really takes away from the experience and takes away from that charm, and ultimately hurts the next generation of Disney fans because they don't necessarily have those positive experiences, or at least not the same fond memories that we did as a kid. I do fear that that's happening, and it's going to be something that you're not going to be able to determine and even quantify for another decade or two.
Yeah, I had a lot of concerns with that, especially, this was more something I talked about a few years ago, but when I thought about when Diagon Alley came out, and then I felt like, okay, and this was really when Disney was going, I know they've had price increases, but they were going in the weird direction with some of the upcharges, like the tents and the buses and all those things. And I was just starting to think, I was like, a lot of us have been going for a really long time, but they really rely on generational, people going and continuing to go and having their kids go and having their kids go and have it be, what if with Harry Potter and everything going with Universal, and I don't think it's happened yet, but what if somehow that's shifting? And what if, like you said, all of a sudden people that have 2-year-olds now or whatever, they're teenagers, grow up going somewhere different. And I don't think that's there, at least from what I can tell. Now, we'll see, depending on when Universal opens their new park in 2023 and more updates they make down the road, where things will shift. But it's interesting to me to think, also a little scary, about what, I grew up in the 80s. I think you're a little bit younger than me, but, similar time frame in general going to the parks. And for me, I went as a kid, it connected with me, and now I'm taking my kids. But that doesn't, I'm also doing a Disney podcast, or a theme park podcast.
Right.
What's the general consensus? Is this something you do, or is it something that you're really doing all the time, or something you do once and go, oh, that was a bit much to do? I don't know. So
I want to go back to Disney is still fully capable of creating things with charm that, be it tied to a movie, be it not tied to a movie, that doesn't really matter. And I'm going to point back to Flight of Passage. And I don't recall if I told this story on Marty Called, but the second to last ride that I rode on my last trip, I was in there as a single rider, and there was a couple of families around me, both with kids, probably in the 8 to 10 range. And there was a boy in one family and a girl in another family, and both were very nervous going onto the attraction, not knowing what to expect. And their parents, just said, go on the ride, you'll have fun. Parents didn't necessarily know what it was either, but they didn't trust mom or dad. They naturally trusted a total stranger to kind of talk them off the ledge that this is a perfectly fun ride. It's not going to be too intense for them, but also that it's certainly worth going on. And in both cases, both kids came off the ride and said they absolutely loved it. And I think there is components of that, but this goes back to the being risk-averse component, that people step away from. I mean, that risk-averse component in the box office and theme park attractions, if we don't know what it is, and yes, you can tie it back to Pandora and Avatar, but you go into that attraction, and for the most part, you don't really know what it is. It's not a roller coaster where you can see it. People fear the unknown, and I think that's part of it, and it's why Disney is gravitating towards these quote-unquote safe attractions, like tied to a movie. And I think just in general, that concept is where the shift is going. I wrote something, and I'll send it to you. You can choose to put it in the show notes or not. An article that I wrote back in 2015 talking about it, that we just gravitate towards what we know, and that's why Harry Potter is so popular, beyond just the exceptional execution of it. But part of the argument is that you just focus on quality, and whether it's tied to an intellectual property or not, as long as the quality is there, people are ultimately going to figure it out. And you can love Harry Potter, you can hate Harry Potter. If you go into that land, you're impressed. It doesn't matter.
And actually, I skipped over the first time I rode Forbidden Journey. I was just like, what the heck? And it wasn't just because it was Harry Potter. My brain, like with Flight of Passage, just to connect the two, I was like, how does this even work? And all of this. So it's one of those things where those are two examples to me of attractions that went way beyond what they needed to do to be successful. They were way up there, and they did something that was kind of mind-boggling. And I even looked around when I wrote Flight of Passage, and people were losing their mind in like happiness. It was like when people originally rode Soarin'. Yeah. So I don't mean to be too down about it, because there is still definitely a capability of doing that. Now, I don't think Flight of Passage, like you said, the success is really related to Avatar. It's the fact that you feel like you're flying, and there's all the scents, and it's just gorgeous. And Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, part of it is Harry Potter, but part of it is you're going on this adventure with a dragon and with a crazy Dementor and all these things, and it's like physical sets, then screens, whatever. The quality that went into that is a big part of it too. Now, flipping that a little bit to Epcot, like, will the Guardians of the Galaxy roller coaster, if it's on that level, people will go crazy. But if it's just okay, I don't think the Guardians are enough to sell it in the long term. That's the trick.
So there's a few things about this, and much in the same way that when Pandora was pitched for the Animal Kingdom, people thought that was a stretch thematically. The same can be true of Guardians as well, where people say that, and yes, the original pitch was that Peter Quill visited Epcot as a kid. And you know what? I buy it. I think there are story treatments for Guardians of the Galaxy that work within Epcot's framework, past, present, and future. I think that all can fit. Whether they choose to go down that path, I don't know. But at the end of the day, too, if there is a bit of a thematic break, but the attraction is excellent, people let it slide. People absolutely let it slide. And a great example of this is Splash Mountain. It's one that I cite quite a bit, that technically it doesn't belong in Frontierland, but nobody cares because it's a great ride. And nobody knocks it down at all because it's tied to a movie that Disney won't release from the vault, because they detached it enough from the movie that 99% of the people that ride it don't make the connection. So if Guardians of the Galaxy is a great ride, then it's probably not going to matter that it's an Epcot, other than to a handful of people.
You know, they announced that the recent D23, they didn't spend much time on it. We did not hear about Peter Quill visiting Epcot again. Shocker.
Right.
But they did announce, it has a reverse launch. And this is the thing where I think someone who's really, I'm not even talking about just Guardians, but the big things, the selling points currently of this attraction are, it's in a giant building that holds massive 3 spaceship berths or whatever.
Yep.
It has a ride vehicle that's new that spins, and I do not like spinning coasters. I just am not a fan. Even my local Six Flags has one, and Primeval World.
You may be predisposed to not like it, and
yes,
that's not necessarily Disney's fault.
No, it's not. And the fact is, it has a reverse launch, which, but if they do all of these things to the best of their abilities and do them well, all those things could still work. It's
right.
just and I'm not really that skeptical. I think it'll be, they're spending a ton of money on it. It's going to be a technology we haven't seen, but I'm not even as, that's been around a while. But when I look to the future of Epcot, I want to talk a little bit more about what we think is going to happen. But first, we got to stop here at Mary Poppins. Okay. So you were in that room at D23. Yep. They have Dick Van Dyke comes out. They do the very step in time, the whole thing. I mean, what are you thinking at that point? Are you thinking we're going to learn about the way they presented it? I thought, and I'm not just talking about rumors, but didn't it seem like they were building up to something really grand?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then they didn't tell us anything. It's weird.
I suspect that they knew they were building a Mary Poppins attraction, and Disney uses that attraction term very loosely. They knew that they were building a Mary Poppins attraction, and I'm guessing there were probably a few different projects. They didn't know which one was going to move forward, just that one of them was. That's my guess. But they probably also weren't ready to announce something bigger. The entire presentation, let's be blunt, was oddly constructed.
Yes.
They glossed over an e-ticket ride for California Adventure when that park is a 10-minute walk away from where they were having this discussion. They focused a lot of time on Epcot, which I appreciate as an Epcot fan, but there was no home run with the Epcot presentation, other than from a style standpoint. They had Dick Van Dyke coming out, they had the full production coming out, but the actual substance of it was nothing. It was that we are building a Mary Poppins attraction. Here is a single piece of concept art of the facade that shows you nothing, and that's all the information we're going to give you. And I think at this point, it may not have been established what the attraction is going to be. I'm not expecting anything substantial. If it's at Peter Pan level, I'd be surprised. And the production, the level of announcement for it, if you rewind back to 2017, when they announced Tron, they announced Ratatouille, they announced a couple of other things that had substance. We knew exactly what they were, and part of that is because they exist elsewhere. But they announced the Guardians ride back then as well. And they did that with a little bit less fanfare. And this is, by all accounts, certainly not a major attraction, and very well may only be a meet and greet. But they presented it as if it was Star Wars Land. So it was confusing, to say the least. But don't get me wrong, anytime Dick Van Dyke's in the room, I'm excited. So at least there was that.
Oh, yeah, that was a great moment from home. It's like, wow, he's out there, and it was a great moment in the Mary Poppins Returns, too, when he shows up, which...
Oh, and by the way, we're not using Dick Van Dyke in any of this, but, he's there.
Yeah. He's just coming to say hi. That, real quick, that presentation, that 10 minutes on Cirque du Soleil, I was just like, oh my God, this is too much. Please get to something important. And the Target stuff, it's like I don't understand the whole thing. I don't understand. But regardless, Mary Poppins, if I was going to bet money, I would bet it's going to be like the Royal Summer House, is my guess.
Okay.
And if they have it'll be like a meet and greet. Now, maybe, we've heard rumors about some sort of carousel or such. If it's beyond a meet and greet and carousel, I think that's great, because I don't expect more than that, really.
So there's a few things here, and it, again, goes back to appropriate themes. Mary Poppins at least takes place in the United Kingdom, in deference to Frozen in Norway. But to your point, the Royal Summer House, I actually have zero issue with that meet and greet. I think they at least attempted to tell a story that says, all right, well, they're from a fictitious Scandinavian country, so it is not out of the realm of possibility that during the summer they visit Norway, and this is their summer house. Okay, I buy it. That gives them an excuse to do a meet and greet. I get it. But over at Frozen Ever After, there's really no story to set it in there, other than this is a Scandinavian country and we are going to put our fake Scandinavian country in this real Scandinavian country. With Mary Poppins, I could see them combining the fantasy world of Mary Poppins with the real world of the United Kingdom and flying over it Peter Pan style in some way, shape, or form. I'd be totally on board with that as a storytelling conveyance to give a tour of the United Kingdom, especially if it's going through physical sets. I don't think that's what's going to happen. But if they're going to use it as a carousel, I'm on board with that too, because like you said, they don't do a lot of those small editions anymore. It's generally, a D or an E ticket attraction, and you don't necessarily round out the lineup with your flat rides, your Dumbos and things like that. So I'd be okay with that as well. And when you've got a major attraction going over to France, a couple 100 feet away, I can see maybe not necessarily putting major attraction next to major attraction next to major attraction.
Yeah.
I'm okay with the United Kingdom editions being somewhat small scale, all things considered.
Right, yeah, and I think I didn't expect it to be more than that until, I saw that presentation, and then it kind of got done, and I was like, wait, what is it? So it was like I didn't really know, but I agree with you that, we've got Ratatouille over there, and even just the Skyliner station, assuming that still works okay. People
so
are
far, so good.
Yeah, woo! People are going to be going to that section of the park more already, which is good because it spreads out people and it makes Norway less congested in that whole area. So I want to start to look ahead here. And granted, we could talk about Epcot Forever. Maybe. So here's my thought. I know you've talked pretty substantially on your own podcast about Epcot Forever on Marty Called recently. So I don't want to go through the whole thing, but here's my thought. So I was thinking, I did kind of a Patreon episode about what I only saw the live stream, so I don't feel like an expert to talk about it. I feel like there are parts of that show that work really well with like the kites going by, and maybe it's just certain songs. I feel like some of the, like when they did Golden Dreams and like Celebrate the Future, and some of those songs really work out well. Other parts seem kind of thrown together, but again, I'm looking at it from a different perspective. But so Disney takes the effort to create a show that is focused on historical music from attractions that many people haven't ridden. So should we look upon that as something positive, like they are respecting Epcot's past, they're going to look at it going forward? There's a lot of stuff of imagination in there. Should that give us more hope about Figment? So it's a big question, but should we look at that regardless of execution, which I know is not great according to some, but is that a positive, or is it something like, okay, they did that and now we're done with it?
Well, here's the thing. There isn't really a park where that works with the same level of sentimentality to the fan base other than Epcot. I don't think there is. I mean, if you were to do something like that in a castle park, so many of those elements, those forgotten or gone elements, are far less substantial. Anything in a castle park it's easier to create something that's timeless under those themes, if that makes sense. But when you've got a futurism theme, as you do in Epcot, those things have a natural expiration date. So going to the tribute there, I certainly respect it, and Disney likes to play on nostalgia, but only on their terms. And I think the extent that you're going to see this elsewhere is things that are still in rotation, like Main Street Electrical Parade coming back, and other things that are easy to recreate. They've tried to throw things like a few years ago, I think they did, Tahitian Terrace Night at Disneyland, kind of small scale things like that. I don't know that we should look too far into this, other than they needed to come up with a theme while they built the infrastructure for Harmonious. And I appreciate the idea, but I am very much against the execution of that idea. And I've said what I thought about this, but you're a PG-rated show, so I can't get too far into it. I think that the idea of paying tribute to things and recognizing the past is all well and good, but I also recognize that you keep the spirit of something and then you move forward. That also is a good way to pay tribute to something as well. With Epcot Forever, see it, formulate your own opinion. I saw it once, have no reason to see it again, and really thought that the execution was poor, especially on the last 2 minutes is really what it comes down to. But that makes or breaks a fireworks show. Your beginning of the fireworks show and the end of the fireworks show are largely what make or break it.
Yeah, because as a show, it's going to mean something different to every person. It's going to mean something different to us than it is to... I'm really curious what someone who's very new to the park really thinks of hearing veggie, fruit, and certain things on the show as a kind of from a humorous perspective.
Yeah.
But looking ahead, so we're beyond... We've got Guardians coming. We've got Ratatouille coming. We have Harmonious coming. We have, I can't not say it that way. I'm sorry. We have, so those things are coming, plus the changes to Future World. Two big things that were not announced that many thought would be announced at D23. And this is kind of the last really big question about Epcot is an Imagination overhaul, which still kind of surprises me we didn't learn about that, especially even given Figment being just so present everywhere, and Imagination, like I said, in Epcot Forever, and then a new country. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think either one of those things would happen anyway before the 40th anniversary, probably further now because they're doing so many changes. But from your, I mean, do you think this is going to happen just based on what you expect? And if so, do you like those ideas still, given where the park's going?
So one of the positive thing, the most positive thing for me coming out of the D23 Expo this year was that they established a framework for the future of the park. And things like an Imagination update, a Brazil edition, those all fit into that framework. I mean, World Showcase isn't changing significantly other than ride additions to it. But there's still the space to put in other countries. So that there isn't really a significant change there from a concept standpoint. But by slotting in and defining the various sections of Future World, they at least have decided to come up with a theme that describes what Epcot has evolved into. And I absolutely anticipate an Imagination update. But in terms of a time frame, if we've got a major Imagination update before 2023, I'd be surprised. I just think that that's part of the reason why they didn't announce it. And yes, we all want these announcements. We want to be in the room when they do it, or we want the information. But there's 6 rides currently under construction at Disney World right now. And they opened one this year. They opened 2 last year, if I'm not mistaken. So they've built a lot. And yes, a lot of that's catch up. But I think part of the fear for them is with Star Wars attendance is that they've announced so much coming in the upcoming years that people are pushing their trips off. I think it's certainly a case with Rise of the Resistance and people not wanting to go for just one ride and waiting for the second one to open. But I think they run that risk. Universal certainly faced it in the years approaching Harry Potter, that if they announce stuff too far in advance, then they're going to see people just continuing to put off their vacations. And I don't think they want that either. But I fully believe that an Imagination update is absolutely happening. I just think that it's probably 4 to 5 years away. And as for Brazil, going into the D23 Expo, I thought both were 50-50 for announcements. I'd say Brazil's political climate is such where that might be a little bit riskier, but I also think that your average guest walking around Epcot is ignorant of that, unfortunately. So they could probably get away with it, but they may not have the sponsorship money, because even though Disney pays a big chunk of it, they usually get a chunk from a corporate sponsor as well. I would say the smart money is on Imagination opening first in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. And it's possible even that the Brazil situation was enough. Maybe they were kind of on the edge of figuring out what they wanted to do, and then they were like, it's just not worth it. We've got too many other things. Our budget is whatnot. We're not earning the profits we expected, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, I think something will happen to Imagination, but I agree with you. There is a lot of construction going on, even at Epcot, in the way it's going to be heading. So maybe it's okay to wait. I
mean, if they figure out the layout of Epcot, and they've got basically the construction walls are all around, they've probably got 2 years of construction walls there, and then you start making the actual larger scale changes beyond what's already been announced. Where, all right, if you close Imagination for a couple of years, that's fine, but ultimately you need people. They're still charging full admission to that park. And if everything's behind construction walls as well as rides being closed, you're really going to have a hard sell getting people in there. I get that you need to pace this out. You can't do it all at once. So I think that with Imagination especially, that it's something that's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And with Brazil or whatever a future country expansion may be, I think the same rules apply. But they're building 2 rides that are opening next year and then 2021. And actually, I'm forgetting now whatever the Mary Poppins edition is. plus, they're building an additional pavilion. Plus, they're building a walkthrough. So there's quite a bit that's already going on there. And if you were to do that and lump it all in to be open by 2022, that's probably not good business either. Just thinking purely from spreading out the crowd, spreading out the demand, that's not necessarily the smartest approach either.
I keep forgetting about the Play Pavilion. They're like, a new pavilion. I was like, what? Oh yeah. It's like, well, you got the Play Pavilion, and you've got the, and those are things too. And I sound like a broken record saying I don't want IP. If they concentrate the bulk of the movies and stuff like that into something like the Play Pavilion, which to me seems just like the evolution of Interventions back in the day, I have zero issue with that. And there are ways where you can have characters, show you things from an edutainment standpoint, or just, you go in and you have fun. That's also allowed. We are overthinking these things to a certain extent. But I think there is a framework for Epcot that is kind of in the heels of what's either been hinted at or announced, where it's a logical evolution from what was there, but still can satisfy those fans that go back to the 80s. And you keep Spaceship Earth free of movies. You evolve things like Living with the Land and possibly The Seas with Nemo and Friends. Imagination gets a substantial update and is a family-friendly major attraction. Guardians of the Galaxy has a logical tie back to kind of the concepts of really Epcot. The speculation is that it'll look back at the Big Bang much in the same way that Ellen did. There's a bunch of different things that they can do that don't necessarily have to prey on the familiarity of a known movie in order to make that park a draw and satisfy the old and new fans alike. I like it. I think it's good, Tim. I think that's a perfect spot to end. We covered about 30% of the topics that we set out for it. I think we did better this time than last time, but maybe I had fewer topics. But this was great. I'm now feeling much better about Epcot and much worse about Epcot Forever, but this is good. I think I'll take those. But Tim, so you are involved in a lot of things, and I would love for people to check out what you're doing. So where can people go to connect with you or to find out what you're doing?
Well, first and foremost, if Epcot Forever left a sour taste in your mouth, I did the Tim Grassey director's cut of Epcot Forever. I can, again, send that to you to go on your show notes, where I cut some of the music, probably changed the first 5 minutes by about 45 seconds of audio, kept the section with the kites all the same, and then changed the last 2 minutes of music as well to have it be a little bit more in line with what my vision of the show was. So I can send that to you as well. But to answer your question, I'm on a couple of podcasts. E-Ticket Report is in a bit of a hiatus right now. I'm also on Marty Called, and you can find me over on wdwthemeparks.com and at wdwthemeparks on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely post both of those things you've referenced in the show notes so everyone can check them out. I am curious. I have not yet checked out your redone Epcot Forever. I'm sure it's going to include Let It Go and the Grand Fiesta Tour theme, and then we'll be all set, right?
You know what? I actually like the Grand Fiesta Tour theme. I'm not ashamed of that. And I wouldn't have been happy about it, but if they put Let It Go in there, at least it was something that was in the park. So I'll at least give them that. But,
Big Blue World. You can put Big Blue World in there.
There you go. Even better. Even better.
All right. Well, Tim, thanks a lot. It was fun.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, I would highly recommend you check out episodes 19, 38, and 57 with Tim Grassey. Tim, we messed it up. We were doing it every 19 episodes. You can find all of those shows at tomorrowsociety.com. I should also mention that the show is a listener-supported podcast. I don't currently have any sponsors. The Tomorrow Society members through Patreon have made such a huge difference in keeping this show going. You can learn more about how to become a member by going to tomorrowsociety.com/member. I also love hearing from you. You can email me, Dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. We also have a YouTube channel with all of the podcast episodes there, plus some clips from our trip to Aulani this past March. You can find that by going to tomorrowsociety.com/YouTube. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.